G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here, with a video attempting to unpack the events of a week ago when this here safari hunter, this licensed shooter, fired one shot from a centre-fire rifle and hit two police officers in Church Street, Glen, which is my hometown. Whereinat the last time anybody actually fired shots at the police was 1970 or 71, when a couple of teenagers from Melbourne in a stolen car were chased into Glen from Emmaville. The 13-year-old was driving, the 15-year-old was firing out the back window at the police with a shotgun. They got to town. People were telling their kids to turn the TV down in the middle of the afternoon because they could hear all of the engine noises and roarings and gunfire. But it wasn't the TV, it was in the street. The two youngsters came into town on the Emmaville Road. They went up through the town and they intended to go up here, off to Grafton. But instead they went up Torrington Street and into the showground, exiting through the fence and getting bogged on Hunter Street. And when the attending police officer bent over the kid who was huddled face down in the grass, the kid rolled onto his back, pointed the shotgun at the policeman and gave him two clicks right in the face. Empty. He'd already fired off the whole box on the way into town. Last time anybody fired at the police in my hometown, it wasn't locals, it was a pair of teenagers from Melbourne, and they missed. Okay. So last Friday night, a bloke called Eric Newman fired at the police. And he'd only been living in town for about 10 years, so he wasn't a local either. He's what we call a floating. Float into town, make a big noise, float away again. And he didn't miss. So let's go and try and unpick what happened. And I have a particular reason to be interested, because my daughter was maybe 15 yards away from the gunman when he fired. She was in the adjacent building at the Annabella Motel. So this one's a little bit close to home. So first up, let's look at the timeline. The police responded to reports of an assault around about 11 p.m. Call came in from this place on Church Street, and I think it was about 10:45 p.m. on Friday night. Just as I was getting in my car and heading off to go north along the highway, and as I started coming up the golf club hill, I crossed an ambulance steaming into town at full throttle under full lollipop lights with no sirens on an otherwise completely deserted highway. So I had a pretty fair idea that something unusual was afoot. So here's what it says. On Friday night, the Newman family were having a few drinks, no more than 2 scotches for Eric. The sisters said Leslie had wine and was going to bed when she said her husband, Eric, suddenly snapped and started strangling her. Mrs. Newman said she called the police, and then her sister Kim, who drove at high speed from her house a handful of blocks away. By the time she arrived, police had already confronted Mr. Newman. Okay. So, 11:15, she calls the police. 5 to 11, the ambulance is on its way, and the police had pulled up on the eastern side of the highway across the road from the residence. Aha, and how would you know that, says the audience? Because that isn't printed in any of the newspaper accounts. Well, I have better information than anything in the newspapers. I have an eyewitness account as well as an ear witness account. So here, with the miracle of low technology, we will zoom out from the printed map. We will adjourn to a hand-drawn map of Glen, which shows Heron Street running east-west, crossing Grey Street and the highway with Grover's Lane running between them. And there we have a roundabout. On the corner of the roundabout and Oliver Street, there's what once upon a time was a service station, and then it became a pie shop, and I think it's probably a coffee restaurant. Then we have the Annabella Motel, and then we have what was built as a pizza restaurant. It then became Curry Cuisines, Both businesses failed and it degenerated into being a private house. That one there, set back well from the road because the entire front yard was to be the parking lot for the pizza restaurant. The pizza shop was in the bottom, residence was in the top. Eric Newman fired from the second-story balcony. So I'll just draw in his lines of fire. From his northeast corner, he could have covered that area. From his southeast corner, he could have covered that area. Here's what my daughter says. On the left-hand side of the highway, as we drove past on the way to U-turn for the Annabella, about 11:30 or 12 a.m, there was a paddy wagon, ambulance, and about 8 people on the street. Okay, so she has come along Oliver Street. She has turned around the roundabout. That is her left-hand side as she drives down Church Street to do a U-turn to come back and go into the Annabella Motel, where a friend of a friend had retreated following a domestic incident earlier that night, and my daughter was taking her friend to visit the friend of a friend, kind of thing. Paddy wagon and the ambulance were already there. I'm going to say the paddy wagon arrived first, so we draw that in to scale with the big space shuttle ambulance behind it. There was a paddy wagon, ambulance, and about 8 people on the street. It was like half an hour later we heard the 2 shots, maybe 45 seconds apart. Shotgun, it sounded like. And at that point I went off into a flight of fantasy wherein I assumed that my daughter knew what a shotgun sounds like because she grew up here on an endangered species sanctuary. She's been shot at and around all her childhood life. And I've always said, that sounds like a 22 firing away, that sounds like a centre-fire rifle shooting across, and that one sounds like a shotgun coming in across the fence. But as my son said, Dad, how much notice did she take of everything you said about driving a car when we were kids? Took her a year to learn how to drive when she was 25. So, my daughter couldn't tell a shotgun from a pop gun. She had taken the word of her boyfriend, and he is a bow hunter, and I don't know how much bow hunters know about the sound of a shotgun. So she thanks me for placing my trust in her word, but yeah, she was wrong. Garbage in, garbage out. No shotgun was involved. It was a centerfire rifle. And this Eric Newman, he was what they call a safari hunter. He was in the habit of travelling to Africa. I've seen video shot inside his house where there was a zebra skin on the floor. There was deer, elk, antelope, gazelle, and springbok heads stuffed, poking out of the walls. There was a little baby bear, like maybe this high, perhaps weaned off milk, stuffed and standing up in the corner. He was that kind of a bloke. He really, really, really loved his guns. And if we take his surviving wife at face value, he just snapped. They were happy and fine at 9 o'clock, and just before 11 o'clock, he went right off his head and commenced strangling her apropos of nothing at all. Okay, maybe he had a temporal lobe epileptic fit and he wasn't responsible for his actions, but somebody else would have to do a post-mortem examination to determine that if there's enough left of his head because he used a centerfire rifle on himself. Other than that, one speculates, what did she actually say to him in the 2 hours between being happy and him trying to strangle her? One speculates, what did he find? Maybe on a electronic device, an app, a website, a conversation. What caused him to go off? But anyway, he did go off. He assaulted his wife and she ran away and she called the police. And then the police arrived. And then we have a licensed shooter in Australia who lives for his guns. 74-year-old, house full of hunting trophies. He loves his guns. It's all that matters to him in his life, kind of thing. And he sees the paddy wagon pull up after he's been strangling his wife. And he knows that they're going to come and talk to him and they're going to, 1, charge him with a domestic assault, assault female, common assault, and 2, they're going to serve him with an apprehended domestic violence order. And either one of those things means he's going to give up his guns that night. And unless he's got a family member who already has a shooter's license who they can be given to, he's never going to see him again. So what happened was the police then signalled their intention to speak to him because they moved the paddy wagon. They didn't wait for the SWAT squad to show up from Tamworth with the assault rifles and the flak jackets. They moved the paddy wagon from here, where it was positioned by eyewitness account, half an hour before the gunshot went off, half an hour after they got there. They completed the same journey down Church Street, pulled a U-turn at the Heron Street intersection, and returned to the kill zone just like my daughter did when she was going there to the Annabella Motel. Only the police didn't drive through the kill zone, they stopped and parked in the centre of it. As you can see by this photograph, which has the Annabella Motel sign in the background and the police tape around the site. In fact, looking at that, together with that, and that, which is a more unencumbered view, I'll just redraw this and correct it slightly through the miracle of liquid paper and live technology. So they stopped just on the corner and the car was, kind of nearly clear, but for the fact that there was, unlike on the side of the Annabella Motel, there was no wall restricting fire to the southeast quadrant. So, yeah, the car was still in the line of fire. You can just see how it's parked on the south side of the driveway there. But anyway, now let's have a look at it from a side elevation. Again, brought to us by low technology. We have the back fence, we have the house with the top story balcony, we have the long front yard, we have the fence, we have the nature strip with a concrete section of it, we have the highway, we have the median strip, we have the highway, we have the nature strip with its fence. So there we initially have a police car and an ambulance. So we get a scene something like that. So it's not a really long shot. If we draw in a couple of stick figures to scale, and we assume that Mark Johnson was taller than Helen McMurtry, and if we poke another stick figure on the balcony, then allowing for the hand-drawn stick figures which are not entirely to scale, it's pretty easy to see how you could hit a taller officer in the cheek and then get the shorter officer behind in the throat, firing downhill like that. So that appears to have been what happened. I have heard one particular individual suggest that he wasn't trying to shoot at the police, he was trying to fire a warning shot at the ground in front of him and it bounced up off the ground and that's why the police were hit by bullet fragments. Well, I reckon that bloke is firmly wrong. I reckon that a safari hunter would not have been using full metal jacket ex-military ammunition in his centre-fire rifle. He would have been using soft-nosed hunting ammunition which commenced to break up as soon as it hit Mark Johnson's cheek. And that's why multiple fragments hit Helen McMurtry in the throat. They were already going downhill and the projectile had been perturbed and broken up by striking flesh. I am also informed, whether it's reliably or not, that a police Glock was picked out of the gutter afterwards. So one of them, probably the sergeant, managed to unholster his weapon before realising that his companion had been shot in the throat and he had higher priorities than worrying about what his own gun was doing. And perhaps after the second shot, particularly after the second shot, the particular location of his own Glock was not the priority. The priority would have been stopping Helen McMurtry from bleeding out. My guess is that the major reason she did not bleed out was because the ambulance had already been invited to the party beforehand, specifically because this man was a licensed shooter. He was registered to have, well, his name was on the registry. He was known to possess firearms. The firearms were known to be at this address as soon as the 000 call came into the police station. These two knew they were facing someone who had guns on the premises. That's why they invited the ambulance. Before they even got there, they invited the ambulance. They knew it was a potential siege. She says they was getting along fine and he just snapped. And I heard one fella say, oh, it's terrible, all them bloody greenies in the city are going to say he was a gun nut, but he wasn't. He was just an ordinary bloke who flipped and he couldn't face the paperwork for bashing his wife or trying to strangle her. So he shot at the police because they were coming to take his guns away. And then he realised that he couldn't face the paperwork for bashing his wife, let alone for shooting 2 cops and hitting them. So he took his boot off because you can't reach the trigger on a 303, and he shot himself with his toe. God help the next licensed shooter who bashes his wife. The cops will arrive loaded for bear. Ciao.